All right, let's jump in. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a name that resonates globally, a place synonymous with martial arts and spiritual discipline, Shaolin Monastery.
Hmm.
For many of us, Shaolin instantly conjures images of serene monks executing incredible kung fu techniques. But if you peer beneath the surface, the history of this iconic institution is far more complex.
Oh, absolutely. It's a rich tapestry, really, woven from, Buddhism, the evolution of Chinese martial arts, and its ever-changing, often surprising role in the grand sweep of Chinese identity.
It's a history that defies simple categorization, isn't it?
It really is. It's not just one single narrative of quiet contemplation or, martial prowess. It's centuries of dynamic interaction between spiritual practice, physical discipline, and the turbulent socio-political landscape outside the monastery walls.
And guiding our exploration today is a comprehensive historical source that traces Shaolin's journey from its very earliest beginnings through millennia of transformation. It's packed with details that are both familiar and, frankly, utterly unexpected.
Yeah, there's some surprising stuff in there. Our mission in this deep dive is to meticulously unpack this history. We want to pull out those critical nuggets of knowledge, understand the profound and sometimes, counterintuitive connections between Buddhist ideals and martial arts,
Right.
and see how a single monastery on Mount Song evolved into the global icon it is today. We're aiming to go beyond the well-known legends, to grasp the underlying historical currents.
Okay, so where does this story begin? I mean, even before Shaolin was founded, Chinese martial arts already had incredibly deep roots.
That's right, way back. We're talking the Shang dynasty, so 1600 to 1046 BC.
Wow. And what were those earliest forms like?
Well, fundamentally, combat skills, particularly with weapons, were about military training. Pretty straightforward, essential for warfare and defense.
Makes sense. And then by the Zhou dynasty, that's 1046 to 256 BC, things started to change.
Yeah, the skills began to integrate into other aspects of society. The source mentions they were incorporated into Confucian education.
Which tells you something about their status, doesn't it?
It really does. It indicates that martial skills weren't just seen as, brute force. They were considered part of a well-rounded education alongside classics and rituals. Archery, for instance, was a respected skill. And martial dances were used in rituals, ceremonies.
The source mentioned something about feudal power.
It specifically notes these skills were used in the construction of the feudal pyramid of power, suggesting they weren't just for defense, but also for demonstrating prowess and, solidifying authority.
Fascinating. Martial arts tied into the very structure of the state. Then, moving into the Warring States period, 476 to 221 BC, the source says combat skills start to evolve again.
Yeah, they begin to take on aspects of art and even entertainment. You see different styles emerging, becoming more refined, maybe less focused solely on battlefield application and more on technique and display.
So by the time Shaolin Monastery is established, there's this long, evolving history of martial traditions already deeply embedded in Chinese culture.
Exactly. The ground is fertile, so to speak.
And Shaolin is founded on Mount Song, and very early on, the source indicates there's this connection to martial arts, introduced by the disciples of Batuo, the first abbot.
Yes, that's the belief, according to historical accounts discussed in the source, that this martial element was part of Shaolin almost from day one.
And this is what the source calls the unusual marriage.
Right. The blending of Chinese martial arts with Buddhism.
Why unusual, though? Weren't other monasteries involved in martial arts at all?
Well, not to the degree or with the specific focus that Shaolin developed. You have to remember, there were thousands of Buddhist monasteries in China. But this integration of martial arts, seemingly from the outset, it really set Shaolin apart.
Gave it a unique identity.
And contributed significantly to its strong image in the national imagination, an image distinct from other monastic centers.
So it wasn't just a later addition, it was kind of baked in from the beginning. And the source gives some pretty compelling examples of early monks who had ties to martial traditions or even military service.
Yeah, a key one is Xifalong. The source recounts his story. He served in the army, and apparently while on a northern expedition in 528 AD, he was sitting with his halberd.
Okay.
And he had this profound realization that a weapon's sole purpose is killing, which is a source of bitterness. And this moment of insight led him to renounce his military path and convert to Buddhism.
Wow. That journey is really telling, isn't it? A soldier finding peace in nonviolence, yet he joins an institution that will later become famous for its martial skill.
It definitely reflects a tension or maybe a transformation regarding the use of force.
And it wasn't just isolated individuals like him.
No, the source notes that as early as the 5th and 6th centuries, some monasteries housed martial arts practitioners and even maintained small security forces. It wasn't, widespread, but the idea of monastic self-defense wasn't entirely foreign.
Can you give us a vivid example from the source, something that really brings this to life?
Okay, yeah. The biography of Zhouxiang and the further biographies of eminent monks is pretty striking. In 621 AD, officials in Shangzhou were evacuating the city because rebels were closing in.
Right, standard procedure.
But instead of fleeing, Zhouxiang led over 20 monks from Shaolin Monastery into the city to defend it. They actively participated in repelling the rebels and restoring order.
Monks defending a city against rebels. That really challenges the stereotype, doesn't it? The passive, withdrawn monk.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And there's another significant example, the biography of Shijiman from the Mayi region. Monks there apparently had a known martial tradition, famous for their fighting skills.
Okay.
So when the Tang court needed help in 622 AD, they summoned 2,000 monks from Mayi to join the army.
2,000 monks joining the Tang army. That's huge.
And this is well before the more famous tale of the 13 Shaolin monks helping the Tang emperor, which a lot of people know.
Exactly. It really emphasizes that monastic involvement in military affairs, often for defense or to restore order, was a tangible reality in this period. It wasn't just some Shaolin anomaly later on. So these early examples, before Shaolin's martial fame really solidified, they demonstrate that the ground was fertile. You've got the long history of martial arts, Shaolin's initial connection, and these documented cases of monks engaging in combat. It sets the stage, really.
Precisely. It paves the way for the specific path Shaolin would eventually take.
Okay, so while this martial element is present from early on, another really profound development takes place at Shaolin, one that defines its spiritual identity, the birth of Chan Buddhism in China. And the key figure here is, of course, Bodhidharma.
Bodhidharma, yeah, traditionally considered the first patriarch of Chinese Chan. The source places his arrival in China during the Northern Wei dynasty, so around the 520s AD, and confirms he settled at Shaolin Monastery.
And his teachings, the foundation of this new lineage, were based on specific texts.
Primarily the Lokavatara Sutra. It's a major Mahayana text, already translated into Chinese earlier. The source highlights that the sutra contains these deep philosophical discussions, covering essential Buddhist concepts like inner enlightenment, dissolving dualities, the idea of emptiness.
And that concept of citamatra, mind only, that sounds pretty dense. How does the source connect that to Bodhidharma's teaching and Chan practice?
Well, it centers on the understanding that all phenomena, basically everything we perceive and experience, are ultimately projections or manifestations of the mind.
Okay.
But what's critical, as the source emphasizes, is that this isn't just intellectual knowledge. It's not something you just grasp by reading or talking about it. It has to be realized, experienced directly within oneself.
So Chan practice is fundamentally about that direct personal realization of mind only.
Exactly. It's about looking inward and experiencing that fundamental truth, which aligns perfectly with the later emphasis on meditation and direct intuition that really defines Chan. This philosophical depth is the core of Bodhidharma's legacy at Shaolin.
Now, as we discussed, the martial thread isn't completely separate. And there's that famous story, maybe legendary, about Senchu that kind of brings these two elements together.
Ah, yes. The account from the Tang dynasty text, Chaoyi Qianzai. Sengshao was a prominent monk, initially a disciple of Batuo's followers. He studied widely before returning to Shaolin and eventually becoming its abbot. A significant figure invited to court by emperors,
But the story focuses on his early days, when he wasn't so impressive.
Right. It's presented as maybe a bit mythological, but the source uses it to illustrate the importance of martial arts in monastic life back then. It tells of a young Sengchao, physically weak, being teased and humiliated by other monks who were engaged in wrestling and combat games just for entertainment.
And this humiliation spurred him to seek strength, but in a very unique way.
Yeah, he went into a hall, apparently grabbed the feet of a statue of Vajradhara, who's a powerful, often wrathful protector deity in Buddhism, and vowed to hold on for 7 days without letting go. He was determined to die if he wasn't granted strength.
Holding the feet of a deity, vowing to die for strength, that's a powerful image. Spiritual intensity focused on a physical outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So after 7 days of this intense vigil, according to the story, Vajradhara appeared to him in a vision, told him he already possessed great power, urged him to be faithful and confident.
And the physical transformation was immediate, dramatic.
The story says he returned completely transformed. When the monks started their games again after the meal, Sankshu announced he now had strength. He demonstrated it by, jumping onto a wall and walking along it for hundreds of steps.
Wow.
He hung from the ceiling trusses by his head. He could supposedly lift thousands of kilos, and his punches and kicks were described as incredibly fast and powerful, terrified those who saw them.
That description is incredibly vivid.
It really is. And while, it might be a legend, the source emphasizes its significance. This story, which was widely circulated, created a narrative that explicitly linked spiritual cultivation meditation, devotion to a deity, with attaining extraordinary physical strength and martial prowess.
So it validated the martial arts within the monastery.
Exactly. Suggesting it could be a byproduct or even a necessary component of intense spiritual practice. It's a key anecdote, really captures that unique Shaolin blend.
It certainly does. Puts the physical discipline right alongside the spiritual quest. Okay, so Bodhidharma plants the seed of Chan at Shaolin, and then Huike follows as the second patriarch.
Yes, Shi Huike. Born in Hulao, educated in both Buddhist and Confucian classics. And like Sancho, he traveled to Shaolin to study. Became Bodhidharma's principal disciple, spent 6 years studying with him, eventually inheriting the lineage.
And the lineage continues after Huike through several more patriarchs.
It does. You have Doxin, then Hongren. Doxin is notable because he settled down to teach, unlike the earlier patriarchs who traveled more. This allowed him to reach a wider audience, over 500 followers by the time he died in 651.
Okay.
Then his disciple Hongren established his own monastery and developed the East Mountain teaching, further expanding the Chan tradition.
And it's from Hongren's disciples that we see a major split emerge in Chan.
Yeah, by the mid-7th century, the Chan lineage branches into the northern and southern schools. Shi Shanxiu led the northern school, and Shi Huineng led the southern. Although, the source also notes that Shi Faru was widely considered a joint 6th patriarch alongside them.
Let's break down the core differences then. What characterized Xingxiu's northern school?
Okay, the northern school remained heavily based on the Lankavatara Sutra. Their central metaphor was that the enlightened mind is like a clear mirror that, accumulates dust. So spiritual cultivation was seen as a process of constantly and gradually cleaning that mirror.
Right. So enlightenment was a gradual journey.
Exactly. Achieving it was the result of continuous, painstaking effort. It involved purposeful activity, detachment from the material world, cultivating an understanding of emptiness. The goal was the real, undefiled mind. And this required, arduous physical and mental exertion, self-discipline, self-restraint, a rigorous path.
And Huineng's southern school offered a contrasting approach.
Big time. Huineng promoted the Diamond Sutra, and his school emphasized 2 key ideas: directly pointing to the heart-mind, Zijirenchen, and seeing nature and becoming a Buddha, Jianshin Jingfo.
Seeing nature and becoming a Buddha, what did that mean in practice?
It stemmed from the belief that all beings possess Buddha nature inherently, that all minds are fundamentally similar, equal. Because this nature is already within you, enlightenment could be instantaneous, realized at once without needing years of complicated study or gradual cleaning.
An immediate awakening versus a slow polishing.
Precisely. They advocated formless precepts and unfettered meditation. The object of knowledge was simply one's own mind, with no artificial separation between the subject and the object of contemplation. They simplified teachings, moved away from complicated scriptures, rituals, intense asceticism.
Which effectively lowered the barrier to entry.
Totally. Making Chan accessible to a much broader population, including people who were illiterate. And significantly, the Southern School, through Huineng and his followers, began to integrate Buddhist doctrines with Taoist and Confucian philosophies, really transforming Indian Chan into something uniquely Chinese, a synthesis that resonated deeply within the local culture.
So with these 2 major branches developing, where did Shaolin fit in, especially after Huike had left?
That's where Shi Faru comes back into the picture. He was another prime disciple of Hongren, also considered a 6th patriarch. In 683, Faru returned to Shaolin.
Which was a crucial moment for the monastery's connection to Chan, wasn't it?
It revitalized the Chan tradition, specifically at Shaolin, after Huike had departed. Faru apparently kept a low profile initially, dedicating 3 years to orthodox Chan practice before he started teaching in 686. His presence and teaching significantly boosted Shaolin's reputation as the historical cradle of Chan.
And this role was formally recognized after his death.
Yes, a pagoda and a stele were erected in his honor after he died in 689. The stele, titled Biography of Chan Master Shifaru, is historically important because it was one of the very first texts to provide a historical review of Chan Buddhism's development in China. It placed Shaolin firmly within that early foundational narrative, even as the traditions spread and split.
It's fascinating how Shaolin maintains the central position in the Chan narrative, even as different schools emerge. Okay, moving into the Tang and Yuan dynasties, how did Shaolin position itself within the broader religious and intellectual landscape of China? A very famous name pops up with a surprising connection: Zhouxiang.
The renowned Tripitaka Dharma master, 602 to 664 AD. He's famous, of course, for his incredible journey to India between 608 and 643 AD, traveled the Silk Road, studied Buddhism deeply, collected hundreds of vital scriptural texts.
The journey that later inspired Journey to the West.
Indeed. When he returned to China in 645 AD, bringing back statues, relics, and this massive collection of 657 Mahayana and Hinayana texts, he was received with great honor by Emperor Taizong. The emperor even offered him a high official post.
But Zhouxiang had a different plan for his life's work.
He declined the official post. His specific request to Emperor Taizong was that he be allowed to reside at Shaolin Monastery to carry out his monumental task of translating and studying the texts he'd brought back.
That's remarkable. The most famous Buddhist scholar-traveler of his time, fresh off this epic journey, saw Shaolin as the ideal place for his crucial translation work. What does that tell you about Shaolin's status, then?
It speaks volumes, doesn't it? It shows Shaolin's reputation wasn't just about Chan or martial arts at this point. It was also recognized as a serious center for Orthodox Buddhist scholarship and practice. A suitable environment for someone of Zhouxiang's caliber to undertake such a vital task.
But the request was declined.
Unfortunately, yes. The emperor ordered him to establish a translation academy in the capital, Tainan, instead. A missed opportunity for Shaolin, perhaps, but the desire itself is really telling.
As we move through the Song, Jin, and Yuan dynasties, the source indicates Shaolin continued to flourish alongside the growth of Chan Buddhism.
Yes, and during this period we see the state continuing to engage with Shaolin. Abbots were appointed by governmental authorities, which the source interprets as symbolizing the consolidation of various Chan schools at the monastery. You have examples like Caodong masters Fa and Ziduan and Linji masters Zhouxiang and Zhouxiang serving as abbots.
So different branches of Chan were represented, maybe even integrated at Shaolin under state-approved leadership.
Exactly. It shows both the ongoing vitality of Chan at the monastery and the state's recognition of its importance, along with their influence over its affairs. And as a major Buddhist center, Shaolin was also positioned within the broader intellectual currents of Chinese thought, facilitating interaction with other philosophies.
Which leads to another key insight from the source, the concept of the unity of the three teachings.
This is beautifully illustrated by a Shaolin stele from 1209 titled Saints of the Three Teachings. The inscriptions on this stele place prominently under the heading, Long Live the Emperor, quote, the Tang Emperor Suzong praising Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism.
What does the quote actually say about them?
It praises figures like Confucius and Laozi, stating they ultimately achieved the highest enlightenment and, in the emperor's view, bowed to the Buddha, calling them all our teachers.
So an imperial endorsement, displayed right there at Shaolin, suggesting these three major traditions were seen as interconnected paths, maybe to the same ultimate goal.
Precisely. It reflects that syncretic intellectual environment prevalent in China at the time, where there was this tendency to find common ground and shared principles among these traditions. Having this inscription on a Shaolin stele demonstrates the monastery's engagement with and endorsement of this perspective. It positions it within the broader intellectual and cultural fabric, not just as a purely Buddhist institution.
That intellectual openness and integration are fascinating. So within this context, still during the Yuan dynasty, Shaolin also made a significant internal organizational change under Abbot Shifuyu.
Yes, Shifuyu was appointed abbot in 1245. And influenced by Confucianism, with its strong emphasis on lineage and family structure, he introduced a patriarchal clan system to Shaolin, a unique adaptation of Chinese genealogical rules for the monastic community.
And this system was codified using a poem?
He composed a 70-character poem. This poem became the basis for a naming convention that would define generations of Shaolin monks. So while all Chinese Buddhist monks and nuns take the Dharma name Shi after Shakyamuni Buddha, at Shaolin, The second character of a monk's Dharma name would be taken sequentially from Fuyu's poem.
Can you give us an example of how that worked, like with Fuyu himself?
Sure. Fuyu's own given name contained the character Fu, which serves as the first character of his poem, representing the first generation of this new system. His principal Dharma heir, Shi Huiju, used the second character of the poem, Hui. Other disciples like Zhouxiang and Shi Huiqing also used Hui, marking them as the second generation.
And this system continues right up to the present day.
Amazingly, yes. The current abbot, Shi Yongxin, uses the 23rd character from that same 70-character poem, Yang, meaning forever. It's a remarkable system that has provided a clear, defined lineage and organizational identity for Shaolin monks for centuries, distinguishing them from monks of other monasteries.
It creates a sense of shared history, belonging, almost like a large spiritual family.
It really does, and is a clear example of how Chinese cultural ideas, in this case, Confucian concepts of lineage, influenced the structure of a major Buddhist institution. There were exceptions, like monks who converted elsewhere before joining Shaolin, but for those who started their monastic life there, it cemented a unique Shaolin identity passed down through the generations.
So Shaolin's established as a cradle of Chan, integrates martial arts, positions itself intellectually, develops this unique internal structure. But history wasn't always kind. Shaolin faced periods of serious decline and turbulence.
Oh yeah. The later Yuan dynasty saw significant political instability, costly military campaigns, widespread discontent, leading to banditry and rebellion. The source notes Shaolin was attacked by bandits in the early 7th century, as he mentioned, but it suffered major damage when it was ransacked by rebels during the fall of the Yuan dynasty in the 1350s.
So despite its fame and connections, it was still vulnerable to the chaos of the times.
Absolutely. However, Shaolin demonstrated remarkable resilience, particularly during the Ming dynasty. The early Ming court focused on rebuilding the economy, social order, and Shaolin emerged not just as a religious center, but actively served the Ming government as a loyal military force.
So the warrior monk identity becomes central again, this time in service to the state.
Precisely. The monks were involved in direct military actions. The source lists specific instances. Battles against various rebel leaders like Chen Wangtang, Xishang Zhao, and very practically, they fought against pirates raiding the coastal regions in the mid-16th century.
Fighting pirates, that's certainly a concrete way to apply their skills. Did this service earn them recognition and benefits from the state?
It did. In 1415, following an appeal to the court, the provincial governor showed sympathy and granted Shaolin monks exemption from tax and corvée labor. The monastery's farmland was returned to the county, distributed to local farmers. This meant the monks were freed from the burden of farming and paying taxes on the land themselves.
And crucially, they were explicitly instructed to continue their martial arts training.
Yes, they were told to maintain their skills and be ready for further military orders. The source also emphasizes the heroism of monks who lost their lives on the battlefield during this period, noting their service deserved recognition.
This Ming era also provides some incredibly vivid descriptions of Shaolin martial arts in the sources.
We get glimpses through poems and written accounts. One poem describing combat portrays the monks' movements as powerful as flying dragons, highlights their amazing body flexibility, like monkeys, rabbits.
Wow.
It emphasizes their speed, fast as wind, and the effectiveness of their weapons, like the shining spear and swords, noting their powerful attacks could easily penetrate, crush bones. Yet their movements were so precise.
Those are powerful images. Really brings the skill to life.
And then there's that poignant poem by the scholar official Yuan Hongdao, written in the late 16th century. He describes a senior Shaolin monk, aged with white hair and silver eyebrows, returning to Wuru Peak. Despite his age and location, the monk still dreams of battles, has less interest in chanting scriptures, uses his iron staff as a pillow, and has hung his monastic robe, his kasaya, on a pine tree, still eager to serve justice.
That poem perfectly captures the enduring spirit of the warrior monk, even in retirement.
It really does. And the respect for their martial skill wasn't just from poets. It came from military leaders, too. General Yu Deyu, a famous general known for fighting pirates, visited Shaolin in 1566.
And he was clearly impressed by their staff techniques.
So much so that he recognized their distinct skill and took 2 Shaolin monks with him to further study his own staff methods. Yu Deyu gave one of the monks, Zhouxiang, a copy of his own martial arts manual, the Sword Classic, and even wrote a poem for him. praised his staff skills, but also offered philosophical advice on the emptiness of material pursuits, the importance of self-cultivation.
And Zhouxiang responded with his own poem, vowing to train with the sword classic to fight the dragon.
This exchange is incredibly telling. It shows not only high-level military respect for Shaolin's techniques, but a genuine exchange of knowledge at the highest levels. Yu Deyu actively supported Shaolin, helping them secure donations for renovations and writing a memorial expressing his hope that Zhouxiang would pass down his staff techniques, ensuring the knowledge wasn't lost.
So the knowledge was valued, codified, transmitted. This period also saw the production of significant martial arts manuals linked to Shaolin.
Yes. Cheng Zongyu, a martial arts expert who studied at Shaolin, compiled the Elucidation of Shaolin Staff Methods in 1616. The source notes this manual remains widely regarded as authentic, has been republished multiple times, and is still studied globally today, a testament to the systematization and transmission of their techniques.
And we can't talk about Shaolin martial arts manuals without addressing those legendary texts often attributed to Bodhidharma, the muscle development classic, Yi Jin Jing, and the tendon washing classic, Shu Zi Jing.
Right. These manuals, compiled by a Taoist priest named Zhouxiang in 1624, are famously accompanied by prefaces attributing them to Bodhidharma. The legend holds that after his 9-year meditation, facing the wall in a cave on Wuru Peak near Shaolin, Bodhidharma observed that the monks were physically weak and struggled to maintain concentration during meditation.
And these exercises were his solution.
According to the legend, yes. Bodhidharma left the Yi Jin Jing for the monks to build their physical strength, and the Shi Sui Jing was supposedly taken by his successor, Weik. The purpose, as framed in these legends and texts, wasn't just general fitness. It was explicitly to build the body into a solid vessel necessary for the soul, to aid concentration in meditation, facilitate enlightenment, and prevent practitioners from getting, lost in meditation.
There's even a 1915 manual, Principles of Shaolin Kung Fu, that credits the famous 18 Arhat hands to Bodhidharma for this same purpose.
It reinforces this powerful narrative connecting physical training directly to spiritual advancement. However, it's crucial to acknowledge, as the source does, the historical debate around these texts.
Right.
Critical scholars like Tang Hao have argued that the Yi Jin Jing and Shi Sui Jing were likely produced by Taoist priests and later falsely attributed to Bodhidharma to give them greater legitimacy and a Buddhist veneer.
That challenges a core part of the Shaolin mythos for many people. How does knowing that alternative perspective change how we see the Shaolin story?
Well, it adds a layer of complexity, doesn't it? Reminds us that history is often intertwined with myth and later narrative construction. While the historical accuracy of Bodhidharma creating these specific exercises might be debated, the legend itself became incredibly important. It provided a philosophical framework, a powerful story, that explained and justified the integration of intense physical training, Kung Fu, with deep spiritual practice, Chan Buddhism, at Shaolin. It solidified the idea of training body and soul together as central to the Shaolin identity.
Regardless of origin, the story became the foundation for that philosophical link. By the late Ming, the reputation of Shaolin Kung Fu was undeniable.
Oh yeah, by the late 16th century, Shaolin was recognized as a leading force in the martial arts world. The source provides fantastic quotes from respected figures. Mao Yuanyi, a military expert, declared that all martial arts styles stem from staff techniques, and staff techniques originated in Shaolin. General Yu Deyu called the monastery world-renowned for its staff technique. Scholar official Tang Junzi praised the unique Shaolin combat technique as being among the top, and the Neo-Confucian philosopher Wang Zhanji specifically noted Shaolin's fame for its aggressive striking techniques.
Those are powerful endorsements from across different sectors of society. Shaolin's martial skill was clearly recognized and celebrated. But the late Ming era, like the late Yuan, ended in turmoil.
It did. In 1641, during the widespread unrest accompanying the fall of the Ming, Shaolin was attacked by a rebel bandit force led by Li Jiyu and fell into a state of decay, another period of hardship before the dawn of a new dynasty.
So we move into the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911. What was Shaolin's experience like under the king?
Initially, things were relatively positive. The early Qing government was generally supportive of Buddhism, and Shaolin benefited from a period of peace and stability. There were renovations funded by sympathetic officials, and even the court led a major restoration approved by the young Zheng Emperor in 1735. The Kangxi Emperor himself visited and left inscriptions.
That suggests a continuation of the state's recognition and support we saw in the Ming.
Yes, but this began to change. By the 19th century, Buddhism across China saw a general stagnation, and Shaolin was affected. It struggled to regain its prominence as a center of Buddhist studies. Crucially, the Qing government became increasingly apprehensive about large, organized groups, particularly those associated with martial arts.
And they took action against martial arts practice.
Big time. The Zhouxiang emperor banned the teaching and practice of martial arts in public in 1727. This ban was reaffirmed by the Qianlong emperor, who added severe punishments for practitioners to the Great Qing Legal Code in 1740 and 1813.
That must have put immense pressure on Shaolin's martial tradition.
It forced it underground. The source mentions that according to the 1894 travelogue of Shi Shujin, the monks had to conduct their kung fu training indoors at night in the Thousand Buddhas Hall to avoid detection.
Shi Shujin's visit gives us a window into this era of suppressed practice, right?
It really does. He visited Shaolin, saw the statue of Canara King, recognizing it as a symbol of their martial tradition. The monks were initially hesitant to discuss kung fu because of the ban, but he eventually persuaded them to demonstrate. He described their performance as being powerful as bears and as flexible as birds, and truly remarkable, even while acknowledging claims that the tradition had declined from its peak.
So the skill was still present, just hidden away. This period also saw different narratives about Shaolin circulate in popular culture, some tying it to political resistance.
Yes. With the king suppressing martial arts and the rise of secret societies like the Tiandihui, or Heaven and Earth Society, anti-king sentiments grew, and myths emerged connecting martial arts centers to these movements.
And there's a prominent legend linking the Tiandihui's origins directly to Shaolin.
The Zhilu legend. It tells of Shaolin monks helping the Kangxi emperor defeat Zhilu barbarians, but then being persecuted by a treacherous official. 18 monks escape, find an incense burner bearing the slogan, "Revive Ming, Exterminate King." And 6 of these monks, led by Wan Tixi, eventually formed the Hongmen Society, with 108 members taking the family name Hong.
That legend explicitly positions Shaolin as a hotbed of anti-king sentiment and resistance.
It became a very popular myth, particularly as anti-Manchu feelings grew. This influenced how Shaolin was portrayed in popular culture, like in late King Wuxian novels. For instance, the prosperous and Great Qing dynasty uses this theme, but portrays a southern Shaolin branch as villainous, violent, opposing the virtuous Wudang masters and the Qing forces.
So, depending on the political stance of the author, Shaolin could be a symbol of national resistance or a force of chaos.
Exactly. It shows how a historical institution's identity can be molded and portrayed differently depending on the prevailing political narrative and the popular myths that take hold. How does a religious place get so intertwined with political resistance, even to the point of being portrayed villainously in some stories? It speaks to the power of narrative and shaping perception,
Moving into the Republican era, 1912 to 1949, China was plunged into even greater turmoil.
It was a period of warlordism, civil wars, and increasing anti-Buddhist policies under the nationalist government. Shaolin suffered tremendously. In 1928, it was deliberately torched by the warlord Zhouxiang and never fully recovered from that devastation. It was also impacted by the Sino-Japanese War and the subsequent Civil War.
How did the monastery and the monks survive this period of chaos and destruction?
Well, leaders like Shi Xingjing guided the remaining monks through these difficult times. The source highlights the dedication of Shi Suxi, who worked in a Buddhist statue factory for over a year just to earn money for the monastery's operating expenses, brought back 160 silver dollars. His devotion is noted in a poem in the source.
Wow.
Monks were also integrated into agricultural collectives and often forced to prioritize farming over their religious practice.
So daily life became focused on sheer survival. Was the kung fu tradition still maintained through all of this?
Despite the hardships and the physical decay of the monastery, the tradition wasn't completely extinguished. Figures like Hanglin and Miaoxing continued the lineage. Hanglin even organized lay disciples into a self-defense regulation force, but the source notes this actually drew Shaolin further into the ongoing conflicts.
We also have travelogue descriptions from this era that give us a sense of what visitors observed.
Yeah, Zhouxiang visited around 1917 and was impressed by a young monk performing a staff routine. Jiang Shunen, in 1920, saw Miaoxing perform the Hongquan routines, mentioning his teacher, Hanglin, was a master, but was ill indicating both continuity and decline.
Right.
And Zhuan Shan, in 1925, saw unarmed and two-man drills, praised their speed and precision, but also noted that the superior skills depicted in the monastery's murals seemed to be lost.
These accounts paint a picture of a tradition persevering, carried by dedicated individuals, but certainly diminished by the circumstances. Alongside this, the Republican era saw Chinese martial arts take on a strong connection to nationalism.
Absolutely. There was a state-sponsored promotion of sport and physical education, driven by intense nationalism and militarism. The idea was that Chinese martial arts, referred to as gushu or national skill, embody the Chinese character, could unite the populace, improve public health, and thus contribute to national revival.
Ma Liang, a military governor who was an expert in Shaolin school techniques, was a key figure in this movement.
In 1911, he launched a campaign promoting martial arts education as a national treasure, essential for national rejuvenation. He compiled the Chinese New Wushu textbook series, based on military exercises covering various techniques.
And this curriculum was adopted by the government.
It was adopted by the Army and police in 1917 and promoted in schools starting in 1918. Prominent state leaders even endorsed the textbooks. Leading intellectual Liang Qikou, an influential Enlightenment thinker, endorsed the Chinese New Wushu staff methods. He incorporated the legendary history of Shaolin, including the 13 Monks' Tale, and emphasized martial arts' political importance for national salvation.
The May 4th movement in 1919 also seems to have solidified this link between martial arts and patriotism.
Yes, practicing martial arts became widely seen as a fundamental way to contribute to national salvation. A Ministry of Education report from that time stated, with clear patriotic fervor, that national skill gushu carries the spirit of the Chinese nation and should be foundational in education.
This nationalistic sentiment was even reflected in the ethos of the Shaolin school itself during this period.
A text quoted in the source is quite explicit about this. It says, "Our Shaolin school is infused with the spirit of revenge. The country was invaded. Wait for opportunities. If heaven lets the Han survive, we will succeed." It even adds a note about contemporary threats from imperialist powers, directly linking their martial training to resisting foreign aggression and seeking national vindication.
So during this era, wushu histories were often written to reinforce this narrative, tracing martial arts back through history, highlighting figures like Bodhidharma at Shaolin, noting a decline during the repressive king, and portraying a revival in the Republic era as part of national renewal.
Exactly, drawing on works like A Brief Study of National Skills.
Right.
However, it wasn't just a simple acceptance of the traditional narratives. This era also saw scholarly debate challenging some of the long-held myths.
Academic critiques of Shaolin's origins began to emerge.
Yes, scholars like Zhouxiang, a literature lecturer, published works in 1928 and 1936, arguing that Shaolin Kung Fu wasn't actually invented by Bodhidharma. He claimed that the Kung Fu found in certain manuals attributed to Shaolin was a mixture of various other schools, and even questioned the authenticity of techniques depicted in certain illustrated manuals, suggesting they weren't genuinely from the Ming Dynasty Shaolin tradition.
And Tang Hao, whom we mentioned earlier in relation to the Yi Jinjing critique, also contributed to this debate.
In 1937, Tang Hao published research exploring Shaolin's history, the warrior monks, combat origins, staff methods. He famously critiqued the attribution of the muscle development classic and tendon watching classic to Bodhidharma, arguing they were produced by Taoist priests.
What does it tell us that even back then, historical and academic study was challenging these deeply ingrained popular narratives about Shaolin?
It shows a critical intellectual engagement with history and myth. It adds that layer of academic scrutiny to the story, reminding us that the popular image of Shaolin has always been a blend of historical fact, legend, and later interpretation, subject to ongoing debate.
Speaking of popular interpretation, the Republican era also saw the explosion of wuxia culture martial arts hero novels, where Shaolin became a hugely important symbol.
Wuxia novels became immensely popular from the early 1910s onwards. Often set against nationalist backdrops, whether anti-Manchu sentiment, the Boxer Rebellion, or the 1911 Revolution, Shaolin provided a powerful, recognizable symbol within this genre.
And this is where the idea of a Southern Shaolin branch gained significant traction.
Yes, many stories featured a legendary Southern Shaolin temple, often located in Fujian. It's not historically confirmed as a major continuous branch like the Shaolin Monastery on Mount Song, but it became hugely influential in popular culture. Think of the lineage connecting the legendary Southern Shaolin abbot Zhouxiang to figures like Luo Kai, Huang Tai, Huang Qing, and eventually the globally famous Huang Feihong.
Huang Feihong, often portrayed as a military instructor and later a medical center owner, became an iconic figure partly through this legendary lineage.
Absolutely. This lineage became incredibly popular through novels and later, of course, Hong Kong martial arts movies. Shaolin, both the northern and the legendary southern branches, was consistently used as a symbol.
A symbol of what exactly?
The source notes it was regarded as a symbol of indigenous virtue and strength. Novelists and later film producers used Shaolin and its associated legends to, well, invent a cultural identity and contribute to the construction of a modern Chinese national identity during the challenging early decades of the Republic of China. The source says these wuxia stories helped Shaolin lay a rhetorical claim to Chinese identity.
So Shaolin transitions from a monastic institution with martial ties to a national symbol in a time of crisis, propelled by both state policy and popular culture. This brings us to the modern era, after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. What happened to Shaolin then?
Initially, the new communist government established tight control over religious institutions, aiming to align them with state interests. In 1950, all of Shaolin's land was confiscated and distributed to farmers, leaving fewer than 20 monks residing there.
That must have felt like a major setback for the monastery itself.
It was. But interestingly, the government also issued decrees to protect famous Buddhist monasteries as historical and cultural sites. Shaolin received relatively favorable treatment in this regard compared to some other religious sites. The government actually provided significant funding RMB 120,500 between 1951 and 1963 for repair work on key buildings like the Thousand Buddhist Hall, main halls, pagodas, and murals.
So the state saw historical and cultural value in Shaolin, even as it asserted control over religious life.
Exactly. It was declared a key historical and cultural site at the provincial level in 1963 and received visits from influential politicians, intellectuals, artists. While initial religious policy was somewhat tolerant, it became more radical later, viewing religion as a vestige of feudal culture.
Yet there was some legal protection and official structures for religion.
The 1954 PRC Constitution, Article 88, affirms citizens' freedom of religious belief, and the Administration for Religious Affairs was established that same year. State influence was also seen in how monks were trained. Some attended state-organized programs like Zhouxiang and Miaoxing in Wuhan in 1958, and Zhouxiang and Miaoxing at the Buddhist Academy of China in Beijing from 1960 to 1962, where they earned degrees.
This era also saw Shaolin Kung Fu beginning to be formalized within the state's framework for sports.
Yeah, some monks left the monastery to become official wushu instructors. Shaolin Kung Fu was included at local arts shows starting in 1954. The Dengfeng County Amateur Wushu Sports School was founded in 1958, and Shi Dagan, who had been the chief instructor of the warrior monks, became a wushu coach there.
And he adapted the traditional forms for this new context.
Yes. After the national wushu competition rules were issued in 1959, Dagan reformed Shaolin Kung Fu, incorporating elements, even like opera gymnastics techniques, into the forms to fit the new competitive sport framework. He also produced a manual summary of Shaolin Kung Fu in 1962. This shows the adaptation of traditional practices to state-sponsored sports development.
And all the while, Hong Kong wuxia movies were still driving interest in Shaolin Kung Fu, creating this Shaolin fever.
Absolutely. Hong Kong movies from the 1950s to the 70s were hugely influential, contributing to the global perception of Shaolin Kung Fu culture. They often linked wushu to nationalism and portrayed fictional stories of resistance, making Shaolin a key representation of Chinese national identity in popular global cinema.
But then came the devastating Cultural Revolution.
A period where religion was violently suppressed. Shaolin was ransacked by Red Guards, monks were forced to abandon rituals, and the country itself was brought to the verge of collapse. It was a dark time for religious institutions across China.
However, a political turning point eventually opened the door for change.
The Lin Biao incident in 1971 led to a questioning of the Cultural Revolution's direction. Zhu Enlai took a more prominent role, and officials and scholars who had been purged began to return to power, initiating discussions about restoring the economy and education. This gradual political shift created the environment necessary for Shaolin's eventual revival.
And that revival truly began in the late 1970s, after the Cultural Revolution ended.
With new, more open religious policies emerging after the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, emphasizing freedom of religious belief, the environment changed dramatically. Government reports acknowledged the damage Shaolin had suffered. More funding was provided for repairs, and in 1978, historical sites, including Shaolin, were officially open to foreign tourists.
So the monastery could begin to rebuild and reconnect.
Xin Jingjing was a key figure leading the revival efforts. Monks re-established a martial arts training center in 1979, inviting former disciples back as instructors. Lay disciples could train there, paying a modest tuition fee of RMB 3 per month, plus contributing to farm work. A Shaolin Kung Fu Research Academy was established in 1986.
And the state continued to invest in modern facilities.
Yes, recognizing the potential, the state invested RMB 7 million to build the Shaolin Wushu Stadium, which opened in 1988, providing modern facilities for training, accommodation, and large-scale performances. An administration committee for the monastery was established in 1987, streamlining its management.
By the early 1990s, much of the physical monastery was restored.
Most of the key buildings and artifacts were repaired. The focus shifted back to reviving the core Chan Buddhist practices. Religious rituals, services, public events increased, aimed at restoring Shaolin's influence nationally and internationally. Its network of subsidiary monasteries was also gradually restored, including sites like Donglin, Guanyin, and North Shaolin.
What is daily life like for monks at Shaolin today, according to the source material?
It's a rigorous, structured blend of spiritual practice, duties, and, for some, martial arts training. Monks typically wake up around 5 a.m. Dawn prayers are from 5:30 to 6:30, involving chanting sutras and dharanis. The monastery opens to tourists at 8 a.m., and monks are assigned various duties throughout the day.
Right.
For the warrior monks, a significant portion of their time is dedicated to teaching and practicing kung fu. There's a noon prayer around 11:20, followed by lunch, then dusk prayers from 4:00 to 5:00 with more chanting and offering ceremonies. Dinner is around 5:40, and the monastery closes to the public at 6 p.m., leaving the evenings for personal practice or communal activities before sleep.
It's a life that integrates the demands of a historical site, a tourist destination, a training center, and a traditional monastic community.
Yeah.
And the intense spiritual practices like Chan meditation retreats are still part of it.
Absolutely. The source mentions the Chan 7 retreats, which are incredibly demanding 49-day meditation periods structured in 7 periods of 7 days. The rules are strict for the first 35 days. Practitioners cannot wash, shave, or nap during meditation sessions, and even bathroom times are limited.
Wow.
An inspector is present, using a wooden board for discipline, though this is traditionally meant more as an aid to focus than punishment. Group discussions with a leader are also part of the process.
That paints a picture of the deep, sometimes harsh spiritual discipline that continues alongside the public image.
It shows that the core spiritual pursuit is very much alive for those dedicated to it. And speaking of the public image, Shaolin has truly become a global brand in the modern era.
The Shaolin Warrior Monks Troop seems to have been a major driver of this global recognition.
Established around 1988, the troop became a key tool for cultural diplomacy. Since 2000, the SWMT has been part of high-level diplomatic missions, performing Shaolin Kung Fu for foreign dignitaries and state leaders across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe.
The source listed some examples.
Yeah, performing in Brazil alongside President Hu Jintao in 2004, first time in Latin America. Performing in Moscow for the Year of China in Russia in 2007, received by President Putin. UNESCO headquarters in Paris in 2009. UN headquarters in New York in 2013.
Performing in over 80 countries by 2013 is an incredible reach. This is clearly a deliberate effort to promote Chinese culture globally through Shaolin.
And beyond official tours, Shaolin has actively established cultural centers overseas, particularly in Europe and North America since the early 2000s, to promote both Kung Fu and Chan Buddhism internationally. But Shaolin's influence also spread through global pop culture in less formal ways.
Like the Wu-Tang Clan. That's a fascinating connection.
It really is. In the early 1990s, this influential group of New York rappers took their inspiration directly from Hong Kong martial arts movies like The 36th Chamber of Shaolin and Shaolin Yu Wudang. Their debut album, Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, was structured into Shaolin and Wu-Tang sections. The source notes that the group's leader, RZA, and other members studied Kung Fu and Chan with Shi Yanming, a Shaolin monk based in the U.S., and even invited Yanming to record on their albums.
And RZA offered a perspective on why that connection resonated so deeply with them.
Yeah, he spoke about how Kung Fu resonated on a cultural level, mentioning his idea that Bodhidharma might have been part of a Davidian tribe of Africans, and that martial arts forms might have originated in Africa, connecting it to their own cultural ideas of dance and movement. He also saw a harmony between the flow of music and the concept of chi flow in martial arts, describing how his martial application contributed to his musical success. It's a unique, powerful example of cross-cultural interpretation and inspiration.
Shaolin's reach extends into gaming, too.
Yes, it's appeared in video games like Wu-Tang, Shaolin Style, Shaolin, and Mortal Kombat. Shaolin monks. And it even made an appearance in mainstream animated TV in a 2005 episode of The Simpsons where the family visits China, shows its deep penetration into global popular consciousness.
And this global recognition has also fueled a massive wushu industry around the monastery itself.
Oh yeah, the kung fu fever generated by the movies and global recognition turned Shaolin into a huge tourist destination, which spurred the growth of a massive wushu education industry in the nearby city of Dengfeng. The source highlights the Shaolin Tegu martial arts school, founded by local master Liu Baoshan. This school is enormous, over 30,000 students and staff annually.
Wow.
Offering training in various wushu styles and preparing students for diverse careers, from professional athletes to bodyguards.
Liu Baoshan's story in the source grounds this massive industry in a personal lineage.
He traces his family's connection to Shaolin Kung Fu back 7 generations, mentions his father was a national champion. He started his school with just 3 students and built it over 24 years into this huge institution. His stated purpose is to popularize Chinese culture and the Shaolin spirit, demonstrating how the global brand fuels a local industry dedicated to preserving and spreading the art.
It's no wonder the Financial Times called Shaolin probably one of the most famous global brands to have come out of China in any industry back in 2011.
It's a remarkable transformation. We even see its global spread in places like Africa, with figures like Zhouxiang promoting Shaolin in countries like Mali, Gabon, and Senegal, opening schools with thousands of students and creating martial arts troops. Zhouxiang was even named an ambassador of Shaolin, illustrating the deliberate cultivation and global spread of the brand.
When you look at this entire history, you can really see elements of Hobsbawm's phases of national movements reflected in how Shaolin became intertwined with Chinese identity.
That's a helpful framework, yeah. Phase A, the cultural and literary phase, clearly seen in Shaolin's early role as the cradle of Chan. Its legends, its appearance in literature and travelogues, establishing its cultural significance, generating early narratives.
Phase B, the pioneers and political campaigns.
That's reflected in its service as a military force for the Ming, its connection to resistance narratives like the Zhilu legend, which imbued it with political meaning, and the efforts of individuals promoting its martial tradition in later periods.
And Phase C, mass support.
This is solidified first in the Republican era through the state promotion of Goshu and nationalism explicitly linked to Shaolin. And then profoundly in the PRC era, with direct state support, its emergence as a massive global brand through cultural diplomacy and media, and the explosion of the local wushu industry. This cements its place as a powerful, widely recognized symbol in the modern construction of Chinese national identity.
So bringing this incredible journey to a close,
we've traced Shaolin from its origins as an early Buddhist monastery that distinctively integrated martial arts, through its rise as the foundational site for Chinese Chan Buddhism, its periods of serving as a loyal military force, its struggles and declines during turbulent political eras, to its modern status as a global cultural brand and enduring symbol of Chinese identity.
It's a history defined by a unique synthesis of spiritual practice and physical discipline, a constant push and pull between monastic life and the external political and social world, and the remarkable power of myth, narrative, and popular culture in shaping an institution's identity across centuries.
It's a story of profound resilience and adaptability, really, in the face of constant change.
It really makes you pause and think. How does a single place manage to hold on to such ancient, rigorous spiritual traditions and intense physical disciplines while simultaneously navigating the complexities of historical service to the state, periods of suppression, and ultimately becoming a dynamic, globally recognized commercial and cultural phenomenon?
Right. And what does Shaolin's centuries of history tell us about the nature of cultural institutions? Their capacity to adapt, survive, and even thrive by transforming their identity in response to dramatically shifting times and political landscapes. It's a question that definitely lingers long after you look beyond the surface legends.